This is the entrance to the government headquarters in Bastia, St. Kitts Nevis. It was on these steps, on the evening of 18th June 1981, that the representatives of 7 Eastern Caribbean governments signed a treaty that established the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, OECS. The Treaty of Bastia created an organization whose supreme policy-making institution was a council of heads of government of the member states called the Authority, and a secretariat with a director general and 2 directors. These officials, together with the 7 signatories to the Treaty of Bastia and the first prime ministers of the Authority, were the founders of the OECS, those who laid the foundation for an organization which 35 years later has become an essential part of governance in the Eastern Caribbean. In observance of the 35th anniversary of the OECS on 18th June 2016, the OECS Commission presents the series, The OECS, The Founders, which tells the story of the first 5 years of the organization through the memories of 5 of the founding leaders still with us. In this program, Sir Lester Bryant Bird. Sir Lester Bryant Bird served as the Deputy Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda from 1976, when he was first elected to the Parliament for the Antigua and Barbuda Labour Party. He also held the ministerial portfolios of Economic Development, Tourism and Energy. He became External Affairs Minister after Antigua's independence in 1983. In 1994, he was elected Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, a position he retained until 2004. In both his capacities as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Economic Development as well as Prime Minister, he represented Antigua and Barbuda on the authority of the OECS and was the first chairman of the organization in 1981. He is currently Senior Minister in the government of Antigua and Special Advisor to the Prime Minister. In reflecting on the origins of the OECS, Sir Lester, now 78, stressed that it was important to remember that the OECS evolved from 2 earlier regional institutions, the West Indies Associated States Council of Ministers, the WISA Council, and the Eastern Caribbean Common Market, ECCM. It was the WISA Council which set the pattern of regional integration that the OECS adopted.
West Indies Associated States.
Yes, the predecessor.
Because that was the genesis
Right.
and the basis for us to move on to the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. And a lot happened during that preliminary period. So by the time we reached the signing of the treaty in Bastia, I think most of us who were there had already gone through the whole process and feeling for an integrated situation, because we realized at the time that those of us who were there, I think Eugenia Charles was there, and of course Kennedy Simmons, and it was very, very important. We then decided at that time, as you know, that we had to become a 5th force within CARICOM, because we felt that we were not being given the kind of largesse that we should have been given by the other larger islands. But we were very cohesive as a group. And of course we had John Compton and Eugenia Charles, and we were very, very much involved in the whole process of where do we go from here. So by the time we got to St. Kitts, we had already gone through the processes of determining that we wanted to have an organization and to convert WISA, West Indies Associated State, from being a loose coming together of the islands into a more, concrete arrangements, which we call the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States.
So in a sense, OECS was not a new organization. If you take it from the point of view that it succeeded WISA Council, and you all had been involved in an integration movement for years before. It was not new in this. It was new in the sense of its format, its structure, but in terms of integration.
No, you're 100% right. We were, and we got on very well together, all the heads. And it was not just a question, as you said, of the OECS had just come together.
Yeah.
We had, under the aegis of WISER, been doing a lot of the things which we later did under the OECS. But we thought that we wanted to concretize it and to make it a more meaningful organization.
However, there had been some debate as to whether or not a new organization should be formed after the islands, which were associated states with the United Kingdom, had become independent from Britain. Sir Leicester was one of the principal voices for the formation of a different organization following independence. In an address delivered to the 23rd meeting of the WISER Council of Ministers in Antigua on 19th October 1978, which later became well known as the Thornbird Speech, he outlined his reasons for closer, more formal ties between the islands. The Thornbird Speech was a catalyst for the search for new integration arrangements.
We had a very important meeting in Antigua initially in terms of the WISER arrangement. And you might recall of the famous Thornbird speech, in which I made that speech. I said my attention was drawn to this novel, which was written, and John Compton always quotes it because it was the genesis of what happened. And I had made that in my presentation at the meeting. And as you know, the whole notion read, and perhaps I might quote for the purposes of the people, there is a legend about a bird which sings just once in its life, more sweetly than any other creature on the face of the earth. From the moment it leaves the nest, it searches for a thorn tree and does not rest until it has found one. Then singing among the savage branches, it impales itself upon the longest, sharpest spine. And dying, it rises above its own agony to outsing the lark and the nightingale. One superlative song, its own death the price. But the whole world silences to listen, and God in his heaven smiles. For the best is only bought at great pain. And so we had all the countries been seeking independence. And this sort of made it the kind of image of what we were trying to do. We were prepared to take all the pain and suffering in order to arrive at a conjoining of our sovereignty and our position. And each of our country was seeking independence. Some had, some hadn't. Freedom from colonial power is what we had in mind, and sovereignty over our own affairs. In that circumstance, each of us is like the thorn birch. For the ending of colonial domination will be as sweet as the superlative song of that spectacular bird.
Leicester Bird argued in that speech that they should not fear independence, as some were suggesting, but that independence should be obtained within the common bonds that they shared.
We do not have to pay the price of the Thornbird. We did not have to pay the price. We can raise our flags and sing that superlative song of success again and again. It is our inherent right to be free of colonial rule in every form. But even as we cut our moorings from Britain and begin to chart our own course as captains of our own ships, we are all aware that none of us is an island unto ourselves. We will continue to share a common bond. It is about that bond and about independence that I would like to present some thoughts. So, as I welcomed everybody on behalf of the government and people of Antigua, I recognize how closely intertwined are the people of the Eastern Caribbean. We have Grenada, the Associated States, and Montserrat. The chairman, and this brought back memories to me, of this meeting was Paul Southwell. Remember?
Yes. Yeah.
He was born in Dominica.
In Dominica, right.
But no man can deny the exacting contribution which he has made to the progress of St. Kitts and Nevis and its people. Within the government of Antigua, we, and I indicated that, we can count at least 2 ministers who were not born on these shores, Antigua that is, but who are committed to the development of Antigua. Many of you can trace among your parents and grandparents places of birth other than the particular state in which you now serve. Those 2 ministers that I adverted to, Cosmos Phillip, who was the Attorney General, and Reuben Harris. More than in any other part of the Caribbean, we have integral ties of parenthood, history, and tradition. Essentially, we are the same people. Now, let us begin with the West Indies Associated State, WISA, and the East Caribbean Common Market, the ECCM, you will recall. There are some who believe that membership of WISA is not necessary, that the ECCM was sufficient, the Eastern Caribbean, as a clearinghouse for economic decisions within the less developed countries of the Commonwealth Caribbean. That the ECCM was a valuable mechanism is without question, and it will continue to be so even after the attainment of independence of the countries. However, the concept of WISA is equally important. After independence, the name will have to be changed. You will recall, as we will no longer be associated states. But the objectives for which WISA was formed will not have been invalidated by the fact of independence. To abandon WISA, I indicated at that meeting, will be to start a process of fragmentation among us, the LDCs. A step we could not and cannot afford. Even to this day, the concept of WISA was rooted in the recognition of our independence, and it is the concept which we must concretize. Whatever we call WISA in the future, I indicated, it is the forum in which we, the smaller countries of the Caribbean, can gather to discuss our common problems. And that is the essential part. And where we can take common decisions and proceed to joint action. It is only natural that some of us will adopt positions different from the rest. But WISER will provide us the opportunity for dialogue on our different perspectives and will permit compromise and concession so that even as independent states, we can speak with one voice. Even within the Caribbean community and common market, CARICOM, while retaining our own sovereignty, we LDCs can achieve more together than we can or we could individually. I will suggest that in order to preserve the benefits of interdependence after independence, we need to work out a formal relationship between what we now know as WISER and the ECCM. To put the matter another way, I am not suggesting, and I was not suggesting, a federation. We will come to that later. Or anything remotely as formal. Rather, I was proposing the establishment of a machinery to work for the best interests of our group of countries. The ECCM, the Eastern Caribbean Common Market, should also be strengthened for it can serve all our interests in the future.
And then out of that, the heads decided to set up a committee on joint representation
Right.
after independence.
That's right.
And from that committee, the report recommended this new organization called the Oecs,
Organization of Eastern Caribbean.
which basically merged WISER and the ECCM
And
into one organization.
Yes.
Out of what you read there, a number of things come out. The foreign policy coordination was one of the main objectives
Right.
of OECS.
Yeah.
But when you look back in practice, it didn't quite work that way because countries, after the OECS was formed, had their own missions. Antigua, for example, had its own high commissioner in London,
Yes.
in Ottawa. Why didn't the foreign policy coordination work the way it was envisaged in the treaty?
That's a very pungent question. The foreign policy, I think, didn't work because, as you pointed out, all of the countries wanted to retain to themselves the capacity of their sovereignty and to be able to make decisions which did not conjoin necessarily with the other members.
So they wanted to sing their anthems.
And they want to sing the anthem and raise the flag. And then, as you know, soon after that we had the New Jewel movement. And there was a philosophical difference because Maurice Bishop, Cord, and the others, their philosophy was a philosophy which we would today call communism. And it created a problem among the different islands when we met as to how we could have a common position on many of the issues. One thing that was great about the OECS is how we operated internationally. I think you got to focus on that. When we went to Washington to deal the Sea Caribbean Group for Cooperation
and Development.
in Development, we used to leave early. We used to meet at the ECCM up there at the factory. You understand? And then we would discuss the different issues. We had a commonality of position. Then we go up to Washington. And so by the time we got into the meeting, except for Eric Geary, who was on law unto himself, the rest of us had already determined how we're going to go, what we're going to go. And in one instance, I spoke on behalf of the OECS, etc. We were conjoined together.
So even if you didn't have, let's say, joint missions as was originally envisaged, but when you went internationally to face the outside world, you all did it as the OECS.
As a jointly. We did it as the OECS. But then we end up in the OECS, the OAS in Washington. We were all in the same building.
Yes, we had up to now. Well, it's just been dismantled. We had a joint building.
Joint building.
In Washington.
Yes, right.
Where they got one building, and all the countries were
all
represented.
the countries,
so in some places,
in some sense, we tried
you
to
did the
get
joint
it together.
representation. Let us talk about the authority, the heads when they met. What kind of relationships you all had among yourselves? And who would you say was your closest person? Because you basically represented Antigua at authority meetings.
At all the authority meetings. So your question is...
what is the kind of relationship between the heads of the government? Would you say that the authority acted like a cabinet of ministers, or was it a consensus?
No, they didn't act like a cabinet, because Eugenia, John Compton, James Mitchell, and who else?
Kennedy Simmons.
And Kennedy Simmons.
Yourself.
John
Osborne from Montserrat.
John Osborne. They had, I was not a prime minister, so it is difficult for me to have the kind of synergy that one should have had. But they acted conjointly. And that's how we got a lot of things done, because when you Jenna talked, you know.
But I remember.
I would say that the OECS ab initio acted maybe in a sense like a cabinet. You are right. You are right. And we all had a lot of respect for each other. I think that a lot of us respected John Compton, Eugenia Charles, all of us had respect. Michelle, we all, but they had respect for me, not so much for me, but for VC.
Celesta also thinks that the three main officials who were at the helm of the OECS Secretariat when the organization was launched were key to cementing it in those early years. These were the Director General, Dr. Vaughan Lewis, the Director of Economic Affairs, Swinburne Lestrade, and the Director of Administration, Augustus Compton.
I got to give him a lot of credit. I thought that Vaughan caught the spirit of what was required, and so did the others. Swinburne Lestrade, he was head of the ECCM
he was
in
head
Antigua,
of the ECCM in Antigua,
and he played a very significant role. And he had a good relationship with Vaughan, etc. And Gus Compton played a very serious role in trying to hold the thing together. I had a lot of respect and regard for those gentlemen, and they're the ones who helped to move the movement forward. So I think that helped a lot, that the persons who were selected, in fact, turned out to be the right people. And turned out to be the right people. Vaughan was very, very, very good, and so was
Lestrade.
Yeah, Lestrade, you know, and because they were bright people and understood the whole question of what was being achieved, very good.
Let us talk a bit about Grenada, the Grenada Revolution, and what I consider to be probably one of the greatest challenges to the OECS.
That is correct.
Because it happened, what, just about 2 years after, well, when I say it happened, the collapse of the Grenada Revolution and the assassination of Maurice Bishop happened just about 2 years after the OECS was formed. And when it was beginning, even if there was a difference, as you see, in philosophy and what we call communism, etc., there was beginning to be an acceptance of Maurice Bishop within the councils of the OECS.
Well, go ahead, go ahead, and I'll tell you a little anecdote.
All right, and it had one can say it had a striking effect on the OECS. I want to ask you about the impact of the revolution, the collapse of the revolution on the OECS.
Yeah.
And I'll start by quoting for you an excerpt from a speech you gave in 1986 at the 9th OECS Authority meeting. That's 3 years after the collapse of the revolution. And the heads were still talking about what had happened. And let me quote for you what you said.
Quote myself what I said.
For the newly born OECS, yet to find its feet in the world, the experience of Grenada was a baptism of fire. In a real sense, it was one of those cataclysmic occurrences that forces nations to overcome unskillfulness and adopt a maturity usually born of generations of experience. While the debate will ensue for decades to come on the rights and wrongs of the OECS participation in the liberation of Grenada, the organization itself can take pride that today a government of Grenada sits in our councils, the democratically elected representatives of the Grenadian people. So talk to us about the Grenada experience in the sense of the coming of Maurice Bishop and what happened and the impact on the OECS.
You see, one of the things about us knowing each other is I studied law together with Maurice Bishop in London. And so I was not dealing with somebody at arm's length. And the reality is that when we decided that we were going to move conjointly on these matters, we were not doing it only as the OECS. We had the Maurice Bishop issue was such that we had a meeting here in Antigua at what was then the Holiday Inn. And Bernard Cord represented Grenada. And it was decided that we should speak to Maurice Bishop, particularly since Bernard Cord was not in Grenada, and ask him to hold an election. And then after election, the rest of us would support him to legitimize it, to make it constitutional. And I think Paul Schoon was going to be made the Governor General of that committee. I was selected to go and speak to Maurice because I knew him. And I said, Maurice, this is the position of your colleagues here. And we want you to talk to your colleagues and suggest to them that we have a election and you have an election. Derek Knight was there and so on. And they didn't have, Derek Knight was at our thing. And he said, look, Lester. And I spoke to him about 11 o'clock and he said, come back at 1 o'clock. Call me back at 1 o'clock. Well, of course, you know what happened. When I called him back at 1 o'clock, he said, well, boy, Lester, the boys say you can't reverse a revolution. And so we cannot go along with the notion of constitutionalizing this thing. We have to move on with our revolution. And so you see, at that point, the question became whether we would recognize the New Jewel movement and this revolutionary government within
The OECS.
the OECS. And some interesting stories come out about that. Let me say, for instance, let me tell you some anecdotes. The problem we had is that your Prime Minister, John Compton, and Tom Adams were adamant that they were not going to accept Maurice Bishop and the New Jewel movement. So there was a contretemps that had developed then. And I recall that we had a meeting, I forget what it was, in St. Lucia. And Louison, you remember Louison?
Right.
Louison came to the meeting and there was a big brouhaha
Yes,
as to whether you remember?
That was to decide whether or
He
not
should be seated.
he should be seated.
Yes.
And in fact, when the meeting, it was a wiser council meeting.
It was a wiser council meeting, yes.
And they asked him to wait outside. In
Yes.
fact, I was asked to wait outside with him.
Yes.
And after about an hour inside they were arguing, he said, look, I'm here to represent in Grenada, and he just stormed into the meeting.
He stormed into the meeting and took his seat.
Yes.
So that is one of the things that came out of this thing. And so, but Tom Adams, John Compton, and later on when we had the joint meeting with Siaga and the other heads of government of the MDCs, the problem became that they were adamant that we should not recognize Maurice Bishop. So it created a major problem for us. Now, what happened after that might interest you. We had a meeting in Jamaica at Oecs. And you know, Siaga was a hawk because he and Reagan were close. Well, there was a man.
And I remember he said at that meeting, you must have elections that are free from fear.
And that's exactly right, you remember. But there was a man whom I was with named Vere Cornwall Bird. And when we met, Tom Adams, John, and all of the others, Chambers didn't say much at first. And they took the position. They began to argue that they should not be recognized. And Maurice Bishop was in that meeting. And then VEC said, gentlemen, this man is here to represent his people. I didn't come here to argue against the methodology by how he became the head of his country, but he is the head of Grenada, and he represents the Grenadian people. And I think that we have to accept them. We may not agree with their philosophy, but we have to accept them. And Chambers said, well, when the wise old head speaks, I have to go along with that. Of course, Burnham did not agree at all. But the majority had taken the position to recognize Maurice Bishop and the Grenada New Jewel movement.
The CARICOM meeting in Ocho Rios was in July 1983, but by October, the revolution had collapsed with the assassination of Prime Minister Maurice Bishop and some of his ministers by a hardline faction of the New Jewel movement. In response, Oecs countries, along with Barbados and Jamaica, invited the United States to join them in an intervention in Grenada to restore democratic rule. The intervention was a divisive issue within CARICOM, and the Oecs countries were strongly condemned at the United Nations and elsewhere for their action.
We had a meeting in Trinidad where all of the LDCs, together with Tom Adams, Odo, you know who I call Odo? You don't know who I call Odo? I'll come back to you. Guyana,
right?
Right? He was there.
Yeah, Forbes.
Right. Siaga was there. He was there. And Chambers had become Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. The question arose as to what was going to be the position of this group now, because I think they were being supported by the CDU.
Yeah, the CDU,
right?
Caribbean Democratic Union,
which is a right wing.
Yeah, which is supported by the Republican Party.
And Eugenia Charles, and part of the Republican Party, yeah. So we met in the Trinidad in the Hilton Hotel, and in the meeting, Chambers did not go one way or the other. Odo said, no way, but those guys were hell-bent on bringing the Americans in. You know more about that probably than I do. But here's where VC did me in. We were meeting, as I said, in the hotel in Trinidad, Hilton. And they were taking a kind of a vote. as to whether or not you should ask the Americans
To come in.
to come in. I opposed it. Siaga turned to me and said, "You keep quiet like a boy. Keep quiet. I done talk to your father," which he had done. And VC had agreed for them to go into Grenada. And so he clocked me down there. You understand? I called VC and I abused VC. I said, "How could you do that to me?" He said, "Boy," VC said, "Listen, we can't afford to have communism in the Caribbean." That was his position. And so that was, not only that, VC had already given permission for the Antigua
Defense
delegation, military force to go to Barbados and conjoin with the others there. So they were all set to do the invasion before I even knew. Because VC had agreed, Siaga, and then I got VC to agree. We went to India.
Yes, that's after the revolution collapsed.
After the revolution.
Collapsed, yes.
And
And there was, the Oecs intervened
right,
with the US,
you got it.
and there was international condemnation
got
of the Oecs.
of the
You were
Oecs.
condemned at the UN, you were condemned at New Delhi.
Everywhere, without, I got to
But
tell
New
you,
Delhi was very significant in terms of how the
Delhi was
Oecs responded.
very significant. I was representing, in a sense, the Oecs as a protection for John and the others, because Zimbabwe, Zambia, all those countries,
Tanzania.
all of them were lambasting the heck out, and Indira Gandhi was the chair. And so I went to Tom Adams and I said, "Why don't you let me speak first? I'm only a deputy, all right? And I can put the thing in perspective so those Africans will begin to understand exactly how we think like we think." And I made the speech, it's in here, and I pointed out to them that Cosmos Philip is a Grenadian. He sits in my cabinet. My Governor General was a Grenadian whose folks were born in Antigua. I said, we are like a tribe, you understand? And you got to look at us, and if his house is burning, I got to help and do something about it. And so I projected an argument. Now, you know, Thatcher, Reagan and them had discussed this matter. They were really, she said, after we have heard the silver tongue of the Deputy Prime Minister of Antigua, I do not agree that we should put out any communique, which is what they wanted, Burnham and they wanted, a condemnatory communique. And so Grenada was allowed to participate fully into the meeting.
But in hindsight,
Yeah.
as you said, was it a mistake for them to go into Grenada after Morris's assassination?
Yeah, that's a very pungent question. Should they
Should have
Morris, yeah, after Morris was
assassinated?
You know, the general feeling, John and the others and so on, that they didn't really want to have. And Cord, they were afraid of Cord and Hudson, the military guy. They were afraid of those two guys. And because Bernard Cord was totally left-wing communist and so on. And as you know, he was with the others when they assassinated Morris Bishop. So I really must say that that is one of the major challenges of the Oecs and at the time.
But it overcame that.
We overcame that. That's the point we're going to make. Because we were conjoined together. We worked together.
As you look back over the 35 years, are you satisfied that the Oecs has achieved what you think they started out to achieve in?
I think they achieved a fair amount of it. But it's clear from what I'm observing that they haven't moved on to a certain level with it. There are certain vignettes, so to speak, of where we have done something, but I don't know that. Look, the Caribbean Central Bank is an excellent product of what came out of this thing. You can't deny that. The notions of what Oecs wanted to do are still excellent. And I think that if we could get the different prime ministers, and my prime minister now, Gaston, he's somebody that I think he can work with. If we could get him and St. Vincent and son Mitchell, it's not son, Keith.
Yeah, Keith Mitchell.
And but Keith is a regionalist, and would be good for them to go back to square one and try and cement the Oecs. They're going to have to give up some of their sovereignty. You understand what I'm saying? Antigua, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and to have what's the word I want to say? Like it was before.
A more unified state?
A more unified situation, I believe, economically.
Well, thank you very much, Sylvester, for your time and your memories.
Yeah.
And
I remembered more than I thought I would. But very intriguing, very, Oecs was a heck of an educational process for all of us.
This has been the first program in the series, The Oecs, The Founders, which tells the story of the early years of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, told through the memories of some of those who contributed to its founding 35 years ago. Today's program, Sir Lester Bryant Bird. In our next program, Sir Kennedy Simmons.
I did not feel that the people in St. Kitts and Nevis were strongly enough behind the concept of forming a government, a regional government at that point in time.